Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons, Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com. It's not just in your head. Perks include access to our Discord server where we regularly discuss all kinds of things and access to our monthly reading groups. Alternatively, please do follow us on social media or rate us on Apple Podcasts and help spread the word. And this week's random call out goes to patron Linda Bickford. Today, psychotherapist Harriet, Fraad and substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero talk to James Barnes, psychotherapist and author of recent opinion piece, Current Psychedelic Therapies Use Flawed Models of the Mind. It's time for relational therapy.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Psychedelics in terms of drug treatment is kind of in a really interesting place right now because the majority of the drug treatment is still abstinence only, and that does include psychedelics. So, you know, a significant portion of the industry is still poised against any kind of legalization aspect of psychedelics. On the other hand, there is a growing movement to address drug use issues with psychedelics, among other, mental health conditions. And I did read the article. I do agree with, the major points in the article. And I think the way it's being sold is kind of, a very simplistic magic bullet.
Yeah.
Brain reset kind of, approach that I think ultimately does the substance a serious disservice, because I think it is a very interesting chemical with a lot of applications, but overselling anything is ultimately unproductive.
Yes, I agree with Ikoi, who is our expert on this here in terms of working with addicts. I read your article as well, and I wondered what you are doing to make sure to integrate the social explanations for misery into the discourse around psychedelics.
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I it isn't really there, which was kind of the premise of the article in many ways. It's kind of being, unsurprisingly, I guess, taken over. The narrative is being taken over by the sort of big institutional bodies and their sort of characteristic thinking, which is not very socially inclined. It's very reductive.
Contracting human misery into a biochemical disease model that has been proven to be just untrue.
Yes. With
all of the studies is such a hoax by advertising in the United States and now elsewhere that it is appalling. So I'm really grateful for your work.
Well, yeah, I'm aware of that. I mean, it's happening, funnily enough, as we speak. I don't know if you're on Twitter, but I guess it's been ongoing for some time, but it's resurfaced right now. It resurfaces every month or two, this whole kind of, chemical imbalance sort of explanation and where that came from and who's responsible. And, I think that psychiatry has held its hands up and said, that was basically kind of nonsense, but also said that, we didn't really say that. We don't really, it was a kind of pharma-led social contagion, that idea, which is, there's problems with that argument, but those kinds of ideas, those kind of reductive ideas are everywhere. And even in this the psychedelic literature, I mean, it's more sophisticated than that, but it's still nevertheless, essentially in the same spirit, talking about brains, either talking about brains or talking about, very sort of abstract cognitive structures and entities that you might as well be talking about brains, and they think they're reducible to brains anyway. So it's kind of, it's very much the same kind of thing.
Can I just ask, in relation to psychedelic assisted therapy, you mentioned in this article that there's certain assumptions that currently run through it, and the assumptions attached to cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. Could you, for the sort of layman, could you talk about like what those assumptions are in that space, in the assumptions with those things and in assumptions in that space generally?
Yeah, I think, it's definitely related to what we're talking about. I mean, CBT, in my mind, CBT and the related sort of models and disciplines is very friendly with the kind of psychiatric model, which and both are friendly with the kind of capitalist mindset.
Yeah.
In fact, the assumptions being that we're talking about individual minds, and when we're talking about suffering and distress, we're talking about something that's gone wrong in an individual's mind and or brain, and that it's really limited to and focused on what's inside of the individual.
Yeah, all in your mind.
Yes, right. Going back to where we started, the social is just not there. I mean, you have the biopsychosocial model, which most sort of psychiatric theorists will subscribe to, but it's still a very individualistic model. It still doesn't really take the social into account because it's thinking in terms of triggers and stresses of otherwise internally determined processes, brains and minds. Anyway, the assumption that's there in psychedelic assisted therapy, given that it's generally limited to the big group of cognitive behavioral therapies, of which ACT is one of them, acceptance and commitment therapy, which, as I say in the article, is a much more sophisticated model, actually, than CBT from my point of view. But it's still very individualistic in that the idea being that the point in psychedelic assisted therapy would be for them to have this sort of discrete experience that's supposedly happening in their internal world or limited to their internal world. And then the goal of the therapist is simply to help integrate that internally using a particular kind of therapy, that it's all very internal. It's all very about the person's ideas, the person's experiences in the past. It's very in that individualistic model. And, when we're talking about the social, if we talk about relational therapy as a version of the social, then the therapist isn't really understood as part of that, right? I mean, they're there as support, but really they're there to facilitate an internal process in the person. It's not about changing one's relationship to people or the world as such, about sort of having epiphanies and shifts in one's internal narrative. So it's very focused and limited to the individual.
Yeah, that's exact. I was thinking as I read your article about how social people are, like Maureen Hertz writes about, that loneliness is a social issue, not just an internal issue, but that failure to thrive as a disease of infants who aren't held and cooed at and talked to, but are just fed and diapered from an alien hand. That's the basis, because from the very start of our lives, we have to be socially integrated. And that's forgotten here.
Yeah.
That socialness, which comes at the very start of life and without which we perish. It's very dramatic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I put in the article about, which the really compelling thing to me theoretically, and why this is really so much bigger than psychedelic assisted therapy, than really psychotherapy itself.
Yes.
That that developmental model, that idea that we come into this world as kind of individuals, basically, that have to learn how to adapt to the world and make sense of it cognitively, that was really nonsense. And as the developmental stuff has shown us, we come into this world as it's socially open and attuned to caregivers in the world. And really, we are social and intersubjective from the beginning. And all of these models are based on something that really doesn't understand that.
Mm-hmm. That so is right. I remember reading that when a child is born, the brain is the size of a small apple or a small fist. And by the time a child grows up, it's the size of a Nerf football, and that it's all socially connected neuronal experiences that fill in the brain. So if you're focusing on the brain, you better focus on the social too.
Yeah.
I probably, possibly have, a little more interest in the area of psychedelic, utilizing psychedelics for therapy. But one of, again, you guys are pretty much, hitting some of the major shortcomings. And I think, and it's also, interesting how it is kind of sold to the general populace. Because, one of the things about that I hear, especially from clients who have benefited from psychedelics oftentimes, is that they're like, oh yeah, there's this kind of thing that you get this, that the benefit comes from the overwhelming positive feelings that psychedelics can induce.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, the people that have gotten what they feel has been really beneficial has been the really negative trips that they've had.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing of often wanting to talk about it and not a lot of therapists are probably feel maybe out of their scope of practice, but are very unwilling to talk about that experience that they found. And so, they had what they feel is a negative, but still very profound experience. And then not really oftentimes having a space to talk about it. As with everything in mental health care, there are so many gaps.
Yes.
That I think a lot of times, these gaps are ultimately what would fail even what could be effective treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Why are therapists hesitant to talk about those experiences with their clients?
I think a lot of times there's also, because there's also this thing in a lot of therapy where, if you admit to using drugs, then a lot of times therapists are like, oh, well, if you can't, if you're not in a sober state of mind, therapy is not for. So I think, how should I put it? It's basically a lot of therapists are taught that a client has to be sober.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In order to benefit from therapy. So a lot of times they take that as I can't talk about an altered state of mind with you. That is outside my scope of practice, I think, is probably the most generous thing I can say.
I think they're also scared. Illegal drug use, oh my God. I don't want to be tainted with it.
Well, I think there's also, a lot of potential liability concerns as well, because, that's unfortunately a huge part of both medical and psychotherapy practice.
I think it's a shame though, because it's really, I think as a therapist, one of the most important things is to think flexibly about absolutely everything and anything.
Right. An altered state of mind is kind of, part of the human condition.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of eliminating a huge part, of the human condition.
Right. And using substances, I mean, I know I end up saying relational about 10 times a minute, but
good.
but we have all sorts of relationships with substances. Psychedelics is slightly separate to that, but drug use, substance use, relationships with alcohol, relationships with food, all those kinds of things are relationships just like any other, and there's lots to know in that, the kinds of experiences that people have.
Yeah, there certainly are. And also, since I'm a hypnotherapist as well as a psychotherapist, hypnosis is an altered state where people can access parts of themselves they can't when they're distracted by the affairs of daily life, even though and I think all of us survive through dissociation, through going somewhere else in our mind to get through our childhood.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So we've all experienced this since we were little.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, maybe this is a side issue, but the disassociation thing is really interesting because, there's certainly one view of life in general, which is we can only handle so much reality because reality tends to be the thing that screws us up. So how much of our days are spent sort of disassociating or, somewhere else because, maybe there isn't an answer to that. Maybe it's a whole other issue, but
there's a lot to that. Aldous Huxley said the brain is an adjustment valve to reality. And I think he was right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of disassociation, ketamine is most out of the psychedelic therapy. Ketamine is probably the one that's most tied to dissociation.
Yeah. So just as a sort of clarifying point, with psychedelic assisted therapy, as far as I understand it, the sort of main things that people are playing with essentially is psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA, or do they do ketamine stuff as well?
And ketamine, as well.
Right.
Ketamine, all those drugs that you mentioned are not legally sanctioned, right? Because they're illegal drugs. Technically, psilocybin, LSD is still illegal. In terms of legality, ketamine is the most accessible in terms of both legal and in some insurance will now pay for it. There's also probably the next that's coming up in line is MDMA.
Mm-hmm.
The psilocybin and the LSD, I think, are stragglers in that area because of their legal status.
Yeah. Would you explain for our listeners what MDMA is?
Oh, MDMA is the street name is ecstasy or Molly.
Yeah, but now everyone will recognize it.
They used to actually. I mean, MDMA had a prior history in therapy.
Really?
At one point, it was used especially in couples therapy, if I recall.
Of course, that would work.
Right? Because I mean, one of the main things about the main effects of MDMA is that it's an empathogen.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it does make sense that you would use it in couples therapy, but it does have a history in therapy, unlike other drugs.
Yeah, and I think that it's worth saying, to me, the elephant in the room here as well, when we're talking about psychedelic assisted therapy, is the millennia in which various cultures, most cultures, have used substances, particularly psychedelics, as kinds of access to things that can be beneficial, healing, to knowledge, all those kinds of things. And it's quite ironic, actually, that because I know that the psychedelic assisted thing is kind of outside of the mainstream at the moment, but in my understanding, psychiatry as a broad church is quite interested in it.
There's a huge profit to be made.
There's a huge profit to be made, and the insurance, the pharma money is no longer flowing in to the current set of drugs as of about the last 5 years, because they don't really see it going anywhere. And the kinds of drugs that are available in terms of antidepressants and antipsychotics, they're really just producing variations on a theme. And there's a lot of evidence right now showing that antidepressants in particular, they're not nearly as efficacious as people think they are. And I think there's a background narrative here that there's an opportunity here for medicine, for the pharmacological companies to be like, hey, we we told everyone these were the things that made everyone crazy and criminals, but now it's time for us to take them on board and use them ourselves. And it's all just very convenient to come around.
My issue, I guess, not even issue, or just observation with that idea of that it's all going to become profit-seeking. I'm sure that's completely true. I just wonder how they're going to do it, because the stuff that I've read and seen and sort of talks I've been to with this kind of thing, like in London, is it, I don't know if he Professor Nutt or whatever his name is, which is a pretty fun name. His whole thing was that with the experiments they did, like they have this sort of 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin, and then, depression lifted for like 3 to 6 months. So it wasn't, done. It wasn't a sort of a finished thing, but he was just saying in relation to other medications, that's 1 dose you take every 3 to 6 months. So I'm interested to know how they would seek or get a profit from it. I'm sure they will. But
and I think the way to get profit from it is to tie legality to professional guidance.
Yeah. And also
so you have to be under a care of a specific clinic, or a specific provider with proper, credentials, et cetera, et cetera.
And also controlling the sale and the market.
Right.
Yeah. I saw as well that something relatively recently that I forget the dose of it, but it was ketamine, and they were charging like $1,500 or something for like what amounted to half a gram of ketamine.
Right. Well, a lot of that, at least stateside in the United States, is the majority of ketamine therapy, I believe, is still infusion.
Yes.
In a, generally speaking, in a hospital setting.
Yeah.
And so that's what drives the cost up.
Right.
Of course.
Right. But there is a nasal spray.
Yes.
Version now, which is esketamine.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's still fairly expensive, and the main reason that they say is the cost is also like the aftercare to make sure that you're good to go.
In New York, there are quite a few, but there's not that numerous clinics that are committed. It's $500 and you get several infusions that are supervised, and then there's a follow-up group. But these are crusaders for ketamine. They're not profiteers because it's not marketed.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, and there was something very, I think we should get onto some of the relational stuff, but just as sort of riffing on that thing about, there's a bit in the article where you're talking about the suggestibility of people post psychedelic session, and how that's an opportunity for increasing awareness or sort of focus towards relational ends. But that is certainly exactly where the capital thing will come in, right? It will be like, oh, people are more suggestible at this time in their life, just in the same way that shopping habits change when people have babies and all the companies rush in to market you in a certain kind of way, because if they can get you at the beginning, they've got you for life. And you can just see that same thing happening with the psychedelic stuff, right? That they
Aftercare as sponsored by Facebook or something.
Yeah, but and or just like how you behave. It's like it's a moment where you're going to start changing behaviors, so we can market that, and there'll be interest about watching people's behavior post these sessions, and in what ways are they susceptible to other things. So you can definitely see, the old mold fitting onto this, seemingly radical.
Right. This is the thing, isn't it? It's like, so my position on it is really, in terms of the psychedelics, it's what. So the way it seems to be taken right now, and the way it wants to be taken by certain people, and I think Professor Nutt is one of them, in terms of what is the beneficial factor here? What is the ameliorating thing? Is it the chemical compound? Or is it the experience that's had, particularly in a context with another person, right? What is the most important thing here? And I think there's a drive by some people, at least, there was something about, the kind of trying to make an analog of these drugs that doesn't have the psychedelic experience, which... to really trying to reduce it to something where you don't have to talk about any of that, which doesn't make any sense. And I just wonder why, to what extent is it a good thing that this is being thoroughly medicalized?
Right. I think the microdosing trend is part of that.
Yeah.
That you can take just enough to not have a psychedelic experience, but to shift your brain chemical.
Yes.
To increase your productivity, lol.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's pretty bleak.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a huge sell for microdosing, is, quote unquote, productivity.
Yeah, it's not to to know yourself better or people around you or how you feel about the world, but just to be more productive. Terrifying.
Right. And you can see the Amazon feeding their workers for snacks to get them to be faster and more productive.
Yeah, it would just be like caffeine, right? It will be like caffeine 2.0.
Right. At Amazon, they have vending machines with pain meds, because the workers are often in pain because of the pace of their work. And now they can have microdosing machines too.
What a fun future we're all dreaming of. But
Exactly.
But in terms of the relational therapy, like, again, I'm coming from the sort of layman perspective. Like, what, to your mind, like, what separates it or what makes it different from regular therapy, if you like?
Yeah.
I mean, so going back to what I was mentioning before in terms of the developmental model, right? That it's kind of, the whole thing is kind of inverted. The developmental model we go by, the majority of, really all of the mainstream models go by, is that we're born as individuals trying to negotiate an external world. And if you go by the reality of development, is that we're utterly attuned to, dependent on, even interconstituted by other people in the world from the very beginning. So that is the sort of soul of the difference to me, where a relational therapy is not thinking in terms of, I'm this separate person as a therapist trying to give your mind some sort of insight or tools or something, you over there.
Yeah.
It's right. There's something going on between us, right? We're creating something. We create this experience together, right? We're creating our minds together in some way. And in order to, the healing process is a relational process. It's not about changing what's going on inside of you over there. It's about having a different kind of relationship, right? And being able to essentially things like working with consistency and trust and understanding another and empathy, right? That these things are at the roots of the kind of things that end up, the kind of distress that ends up being seen clinically. Something going on with, you mentioned sort of loneliness, right? Loneliness and isolation, and that it's kind of endemic at the moment, and there's something very symbolic about that. That in some sense, right, that the kind of things that we're talking about are not a product of dysfunctional processes, but a product of minds that are alone in the world.
Yes. And needing connection.
Right, needing connection, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because therapy is the one experience in your life where you have an ideal parent, because the parent's needs don't interfere. It's about taking care of you. It's about helping you. And the other person is a partner in your health, in your connection. And most of us don't ever have that.
Yeah.
And the more they go out in the world where it's nothing about them, they're lied to all day by advertisers. They're pushed into a profit extracting machine at work. And it's nothing is about them, even though they say it's all about you. You know, we know it isn't.
Right.
And centering on someone who cares about you is, I think, hugely healing.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And I would say in line with that individualistic models such as CBT is the sort of classic example, is kind of pro-capitalist.
Yes.
In the sense of, you know, it's like get your emotional self in order, get your thoughts and beliefs accurate to the reality outside of you, and you'll be able to function well. Whereas a relational kind of therapy in terms of connection, it's subversive in that sense. It's
yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is, because it's about people connecting, and you see it in the latest Amazon unionizing drive, where they won at the Amazon warehousing complex, where no unions have ever won before. And the way Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer say that they gain people's trust is they created personal relationships. They had personal relationships there before they were fired. They were both really revered as fellow workers who were kind. And then they set up at the bus stop where people had to wait, because the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island isn't accessible to where the people live. They had foods of different kinds. They gave everybody weed, marijuana, who wanted it. And they talked about their lives and their concerns, and listened to people in a way that people knew they were of them and listening to them. And that changed it. It wasn't an outside group of paid organizers who didn't know their lives. Didn't know what their families ate, which they served there. They had West Indian food, they had soul food, and they talked to people, and they were part of them. And so that, in a sense, what we're talking about here in terms of connection as healing, connection is also empowerment, which is what the ALU, the Amazon Independent Labor Union, was about. And it's why Amazon paid $4 million to defeat their campaign, and they raised $100,000 on GoFundMe for their project, and they won. It's the power of that connection, I think, which they talk about, not in the terms we are now, but they talk about their organizing methods, which are exactly what we're talking about, relational.
Yeah.
I guess the only thing whilst reading it, and I think this is something we've come up against a few times, is that you rightly say that all of this stuff requires time. And that is in complete conflict, I guess, with how this sort of world works, looking from the outside in, that it's all very much about do things as quickly and cheaply as possible. Which is
we
why
do run on an expedience model.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure how that gets figured out, really, like in the short term or the long term. It's, again, there's a whole politics around being able to have more time for things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if I even know that this is a question that can be answered because it is the ultimate thing. It's like, if things are going to take a long time, then they cost a lot of money. And then if they cost a lot of money, it's only a certain type of person that's going to be able to benefit from it. And that's a person with a lot of money. So it's tricky, right?
Yeah, although the Amazon workers didn't have so much money, but they related to people while waiting at the bus stop and in their work breaks. So it is possible that time doesn't have to be money. Time is money is one of the big capitalist sayings, and that is true certainly of the capitalist world, because clocks began in Switzerland as capitalism began and time was money. But I think that this is all possible if you could conceive of healing in a slightly more social way rather than personal therapy that takes time.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's multiple things in that the personal therapy versus social change. That's such a big question, because I'm a psychotherapist, and my thinking always leads to certainly beyond two people, groups, societies, etc. And so there's that, and I agree that I agree and disagree about the time being a problem, in that, yes, it's kind of against the grain, and yes, you do need money ultimately in this current system, especially in the UK, where there's no, in the US, I lived in the US for a while, and if you have insurance, at least, then you can get a psychotherapist on insurance.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe it was yeah, but
we have a huge provider shortage in the United States.
Yeah.
The less money you have, the more the shortage exists. Because since if you take insurance, you have to prove why you're not medicating somebody in the United States. And also, if you take insurance, they pay you less, so that a lot of really experienced and excellent therapists just bow out of insurance. So you create a class care system, even if you have insurance.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's true, but we also just have, in terms of numbers, a shortage as well.
We do that too.
Because the entire education system for, even like, substance use counseling, therapy, the internship requirements pretty much eliminate a lot of people from being able to, acquire their certification or credentials.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know several people that went through schooling and then just can finish the internship requirement for financial reasons. It's now common, or at least not unusual, for people to pay for supervision.
Or to
so you're working for free and paying somebody to supervise.
Internship where you are not paid. And there are also quite a few people who just give up, because only in Denmark that I know of is mental health insurance assumed as part of your universal health insurance, taking as much time as you want, because everything that is worthwhile in life takes time, and a relationship does take time.
Yes, it's difficult. It's really difficult. I do think it needs, that the change in all of this, insofar as there would will be a change, it kind of has to come from the top. It's an ideological change in many ways. You know, we're talking about capitalism is very relevant, and time is money, and all of that. It's up against some pretty ingrained, powerful forces.
Yes.
That in some sense are creating the very thing that we're trying to
combat. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You know, it makes me think about being a therapist and this experience, almost a cliched experience. If you're not a kind of, you know, sort of CBT oriented, you do activities, sort of focused person, where somebody might come in and say, you know, I want to feel better. I want to change. I want to do this now. Can we do something? What do I need to do? How do I stop this? How do I change? Like that kind of pressure to change quickly and to do something to change, right? That can often be an expression of the very thing that needs to be looked at, right? To kind of slow down and deal with tolerate this kind of anxiety and uncertainty and doubt and not being able to predict and know and those kinds of things. But it's so symbolic of that a sort of the kind of therapy that we're talking about is so countercultural in that sense.
It is. And yet, I don't know, in the United States, there's beginning to be a rebellion against that. In McDonald's, you have 3 minutes and you are timed, and it beeps, and kind of shuddering beeps go off if you don't get your order ready in 3 minutes, or you don't assemble the sandwich in 2.25 minutes, and so on. And the same thing is true at Amazon, which is why they have an 150% turnover rate every year. But people are beginning to rebel against it. 17 million people in the United States have opted out of the workforce. And they're mainly in service jobs that are totally timed by algorithms where you have no time and are planned so that you won't have time and you'll always be pressed. You won't have downtime. Wow. And I think there is, on the one hand, a huge rebellion against that. And the other, in the United States, at least, it doesn't have a political voice, which would help to change it. Does it in England?
I don't know.
If we're talking about time, probably like one of the most ridiculous, thing about drug treatment is that the vast majority is a 30-day treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where ultimately, if you are pressed for time, that's usually because you are, working in some way under working class conditions.
Yes.
Right. Whether that is, in terms of health treatment, psychological treatment, work conditions. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the major things about capitalism is that it ultimately can't solve problems, because a lot of problems, again, take time and money and resources away from profit. Difficult thing, I think, to ultimately, to change that. But
and so all of these themes are so intertwined. The very, at least in my understanding, and the very basis, really, the basis of capitalism. I mean, of course, it's individualism, right? It's the individual as a kind of economic unit,
right?
And
I mean, and it the brain is separate from the body, because we still treat the mind is separate from the body, and the individual is separate from society.
Yes. Yeah, that's very nicely illustrated. It occurred to me in evening wear, where men, and this is also so misogynistic, where when a man goes out for formal attire, he has a necktie to separate his head from his body, where women who are considered all body and no head have plunging necklines.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
It's so typical that the corporate man has a tie so that his head is very separate from his body.
Oh, I like that. I never thought of that one.
Right. Well, that is ultimately, if you are a man of certain stature,
Yes.
generally speaking, your quote unquote mind is what is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Versus, if you're a woman, your body is more valuable to society.
Right. And if you're a corporate woman, you have to separate. You have to wear a corporate outfit and a corporate suit. You don't have to wear a tie, but you better not have a plunging neckline.
Right. You wear the pantsuit.
As a side, like your Zoom picture is a Magritte picture. Now he's a sort of interesting artist, right? Like, because he dressed exactly like the modern day businessman, meanwhile being sort of quite radical and sort of wildly creative.
Yeah.
It's that to my mind is a sort of fun remix of that you can take all of the stuff that society deems serious and you can wear it as a costume instead.
Right.
Yes, get your subversive message snuck in. It's a good idea.
Right.
But on the topic of what you're talking about, so I've just finished writing another article, which is for Aeon, which I go into again, relational therapy, which is what I talk so much about, but it more in depth. And part of the argument that I make, and that's clear to me at least, is that we're configuring this as kind of the sort of individualistic model. It's very intertwined with capitalism, right? It absolutely is, which is also very much intertwined with patriarchy, the history of patriarchy. And that when we're talking about the relational model, to my mind, we're also talking about feminine ways of being and knowing, right? It's kind of affect and emotion over cognition, connection over sort of categorization. There's a profound sense in it of not knowing, of not even really trying to know, right? Not trying to
He's not control of knowledge. Yeah.
Right. And I argue this in the article that there's something, it's so, I mean, if we're talking about something like a relational therapy or connection in general, right? A non-individualistic model, a socially constituted model, ontology, a social ontology, then we're up against, it's up against all these things. The capitalist, individualistic, patriarchal, like hyper intellectual, scientific. It's that whole cluster of things that is obviously immensely powerful. I mean,
it's trying to find a way to subvert that domination and submission thing that just exists everywhere, right? And I think that's what the relational stuff, at least how I was interpreting it, reading it, that's what it was getting at. Was being conscious that you are not an individual, you are an subjective experience, and that you can be in very distressed situations exactly because of your social setting. And a lot of the time, our whole culture, our shared culture between the US and Britain is based around subservience. And it's like, how do you deal with being dominated, by a teacher, by a boss, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's the thing. And that's one of the things that one of the three things that I look at or point out in the article is exactly that the relational model as a paradigm, it's non-hierarchical. It undermines hierarchy. There's no expert anymore because you're implicated in the very thing that you're paying attention to and analyzing. You're co-creating something, so you can't be in a hierarchy. It becomes kind of egalitarian in some important sense.
It does. Althusser, the French Marxist, had this amazing theory because he was very psychoanalytically inflected. He said that there are three ideological state apparatuses that teach people the lines of dominance and subordination from the inside. So you don't need the police and cops to enforce them. And they are the authoritarian family, authoritarian religion, and the authoritarian state.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to sort of reteach people that those lines don't have to govern their lives, then we look at social institutions that do the opposite, including the system of capitalism, where we know what's right for you. So many ads are the adult person, and then the male voice comes in to tell you, we know what's right for you,
Mm-hmm.
rather than find out what's right for you.
Mm-hmm.
And what's your experience?
Right.
So that your article is very powerful that way, because the relational model opposes the lines of dominance and subordination to which we've all been subjected.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm aware that we're coming up to the hour, so we'll probably have to wrap it up. With your background and your sort of day-to-day working in psychotherapy, I assume that this article is written as a response from observations of how the psychedelic assisted therapy works, like from an insider perspective, or from like you have friends doing that same thing, or you've participated in that thing yourself, or what was the sort of initial thing that drew you to write about it?
I do know some people involved, not in the kind of scene that I kind of criticize in it, but in a much, that there are sort of underground psychedelic psychotherapists, we might say.
Right.
But I mainly wrote that because I'm quite active on Twitter, and I see, particularly in mental health, and I see trends emerging, and this clearly it's a huge trend.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of good in it, in my opinion, a lot of positive things, but I see the kind of vultures circling, and I started reading the research and tried to kind of make sense of it and put things together, and I just feel quite strongly about it, because it's not unique here. It's a very familiar pattern, right? As I'm sure you're aware, that it will be dominated into submission by medicine and the academies and whatever, and it's kind of scary, especially when you're talking about something like psychedelics, because they're very powerful.
Well, yeah, exactly on that point of that they're very powerful. This is sort of, I know we should wrap this up, but I'm just sort of really excited about this. Like, what fascinates me about these very profound experiences is the level of doubt just goes out the window, right? Like, if you've had one of these experiences and what it meant to you. And doubt, I think, is really useful. Even if you had this great time, whatever, on these substances, and you had all these profound things, it's like, when you're coming back down to earth, who's going to be sort of helping you interpret those experiences, right? Like, if you have no doubt about what just happened, you could steer people in potentially dangerous directions. Now, in theory, most of these experiences tend towards socially positive attitudes, but maybe not. Like, I'm pretty sure there's all kinds of examples of like neo-Nazis all getting high together and that sort of forming a bond, So how that experience gets mediated and interpreted, like, that is all still, that's a gray area to me of where I can see danger in the future. And there's and the big thing on an individual level is just that feeling of doubt, or not having any doubt whatsoever, is terrifying.
It is.
Absolutely right. It's such a vulnerable, it can be at least such a existentially, psychologically, emotional, vulnerable place, right? And so what, not even what, like, what's enacted, what systems are being enacted, what ideologies are being enacted in that, and in that state, and this thing of, having somebody in a medical setting and applying very individualistic models, etc. That's a very particular way of going about it. And arguably, it's at a very vulnerable, sensitive time.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Sheena Bilmus, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Sammy.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.